the Parisi Palace, high above 3773 East Broadway. This is the Jake Feinberg Show. Comedy on Power Talk. Thank you so much for making us part of your day today. And what an honor it is to bring in a cat who really learned under the original blues masters of music. And it was at a time when music wasn't separated by genres so much, and I can feel that being 43 years old when I listen back to my guests playing. The blues was right alongside the jazz at that time, which we know jazz emanated from them, and he really took the world by storm in so many ways and has continued on his trajectory in his own way, finding his individual sound, getting out of his own way so he can be a conduit for the music coming through him from the heavens. And he's played with so many heavy cats and from the very beginning. And what an honor. Robben Ford, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Well, thank you so much, Jake. Pleasure.
You know, I just want to start off. We have a game on this program called Name That Voice. And I've been on my journey for only 10 years, but I wanted to put this audio clip in for you and then come back and we'll break it down.
Okay.
So if anybody out there that's listening knows, we did a show together called Guitar Explosion in Berkeley, and I think it was at the Berkeley Community Theater, but I'm not sure. And it was put on by KPFA, you know, the famous station there in Berkeley, and they had the all-time great jazz guitar players of all time. They had Kenny Burrell, Herb Ellis, Kenny Burrell, Herb Ellis. I can't remember all these guys' names, but they were like the best of the best at that time, and all very famous. The more traditional jazz players, they backed up everybody, you know.
Like Joe Pass too.
Sorry, Joe Pass was there.
Yeah, right.
Yep. And they decided to throw in a couple of blues artists because the blues and jazz are closely affiliated, and so Shuggy Otis was the other blues artist, and then they brought in an unknown kid by the name of Robben Ford.
Wow.
And Robben, I have to say, he stole the show. He was unbelievable.
You want to take a guess at who that is, Mr. Ford?
I can't say that I got it necessarily. It sounds a little bit like a guitar player named Jeff Harrington.
That's a good guess. That actually is a harp player named Matthew Kelly. And
okay, I don't know him.
You know, so this was an interview I did with him from 2013, and he's been searching for these tapes from this KPFA broadcast. Do you remember that gig with Barney Kessel and those cats?
Oh, of course.
Can you talk a little? First of all, you stole the show. You blew people's minds. But I just want you to talk to the audience, Robben. Like, you're not like a bop purist by any means. No one would mistake that. But, I mean, you have your own sound. But I just want you to talk about when you were first learning the guitar or learning to find your own sound, how the blues was right alongside the jazz. I mean, there's a guttural, burning quality. And today when I listen to jazz, it's very classicalized, and the blues is so far removed from it. And I just couldn't think of somebody better who shared the stage with guys like Pass and Kessel, and I mean, these guys were boppers, you know, and yet here you are with the blues. So I just wanted you to riff on that because that's the music that I get off on the most.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I'm self-taught, so I never had any guitar teachers, and the blues, and you know, first of all, Mike Bloomfield with the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. That's where I got my first, you know, slap in the face about blues guitar playing. I knew nothing of it before then. You know, I was like 13 or 14. But so Mike Bloomfield was like the first blues guitar virtuoso. So he was playing with super high energy, and he was also playing a lot of notes. And most blues players do not, It's a lot more economical approach to guitar playing. So, which I loved, Man, when I heard B.B. King for the first time, also, I was maybe 16. I mean, I was just blown away. But I think that virtuosity, on Mike Bloomfield's part, might have been part of what made me, want to play more than what I was hearing from, B.B. King or Albert King, all those people whom I love. Albert Collins, my God, But I wanted to play more. I'd never thought about this before this moment, by the way, Jake.
No, you know what, Robben, I want to read this to you because I know that you and your brothers came from Southern California, and this speaks to your point. Northern Cali, really? Okay, so I want you to just riff on this because you're talking about, you use the word virtuosic, and that word is, I know what you're saying. I know exactly what you're saying, but this was from my interview with David T. Walker, the great studio guitar player. He said that. Mm-hmm. He said, this is quoting him, he said, there were blues players in Southern California who were surprisingly good. They didn't have famous names, but they were musicians who could play all kinds of music. They could play a 12-bar blues and run through all kinds of substitutions, solo-wise. In my first few years of playing, I didn't quite understand how they could do that. Mel Brown was certainly one of them. He had the facility and knowledge that it takes to run through chord changes. So, I mean, that to me is what you're talking about. It's like there's this very normally blues players or in a traditional blues settings, it's less notes and more feel. And here you are trying to incorporate more language without wanking it, and yet, in a Bloomfield kind of sense. That to me is, I mean, did you have a chance? Or who were some of the black players that you used to go? I don't know if you went on the Chitlin circuit in Fremont or Concord, but I mean, who were some of the scrappy blues cats that could play substitutions and run through different changes? Because that to me is what it's about.
Well, I wasn't exposed to anyone like that. It just wasn't around. When I would go to San Francisco, I was in my teens. I barely had my driver's license.
Yes.
We were always going to the Fillmore, the Winterland, and, the bands that we were going to see were Jimi Hendrix and Cream and the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. James Cotton.
Yes.
So Luther Tucker would be,
yes,
kind of one of those people, but he was never, a jazz player in any way, but so it was just everybody was a blues guitar player.
well, let me ask you a question. What about like Jimmy McCracklin and the Oakland Cats?
Yeah, I was not exposed to them.
Interesting stuff.
I wasn't going to clubs, I wasn't old enough to get in. So the Fillmore, man, Winterland, Avalon Ballroom, those were the places that I was able to go.
Absolutely, but I mean, I remember interviewing Lydia Pence, and James Brown and the Flames was there. He'd throw his wristwatch out into the crowd. So they did have, it was more R&B. I guess maybe that's. Could you just talk a little bit to younger cats about the ability? Did you learn to hear music before you learned to read it? Because when I talk to a lot of cats today, older generation cats, they say younger musicians' ears are locked because they're learning to read the music before they can hear the music. And your generation heard it before you could read it. And as a result, your ears were huge. And I wanted you to just riff on the idea of, I know you played the records, but you didn't necessarily have rewind buttons. You kind of had to grab the essence of the tune and then make it your own. I wanted you to talk about how you heard the music first before you learned to read it and how your ears grew from that.
Well, that is indeed the case. I didn't have much trouble picking up, like for instance what Mike Bloomfield was doing. I could hear that and play it pretty readily, because even though he was playing fast, it was still pentatonic, a little bit of chromatics in there. He wasn't playing through chord changes. When he did, really take it out there, that would have been East-West, and that was very much modal and Indian, influenced. So, once again, not playing through chord changes. So where I was hearing all of that was in saxophone players. I was listening to, Roland Kirk, John Coltrane, Wayne Shorter, Miles Davis, of course.
Wow.
My listening habits really moved towards listening to what I would call modern jazz, already before, I was out of high school. So what I did, first tried to play jazz without having a clue and sounding terrible.
Which is the best way to start, yeah.
Well, I bought a book full of jazz chord voicings, Mickey Baker's first book, and I learned all the jazz chord voicings out of there. So I started using them with Charlie Musselwhite when I was playing with him, my first kind of, gig outside playing with my brothers, And, Chicago blues, you could use all those chord changes in blues. You can use them all. All of the chords that I was learning, 13 chords and flat 9 chords and all of that were easily, used in blues, which is what jazz players were doing,
Absolutely.
So it was clear to me, not too far past that I didn't know the scales to play against these chord changes. I'm playing the chord changes, but I'm just playing blues over it.
Dig.
So I got another book, and I learned those scales, and I started practicing them. And I basically just applied them the same way that I had the pentatonic scale with the blues. And I just threw myself at it. I was listening to jazz, and I'm like, oh, I can hear now that that's a 13 flat 9 chord right there. And I know that the diminished scale is what I want to play over that. So I would just play in the same way that it's like, oh, here's a blues, just play like I think it goes,
I dig, yeah, totally.
Yeah. So in so doing, I never sounded like anybody else. And, developed my own style, basically, because I had no teachers, and I just had a tremendous desire to play. And that's how my style developed. I was listening to blues guitar players early on, started listening to jazz players, and particularly tenor saxophone players. And I would just apply whatever it was I picked up from those two books, chords and scales, to the music.
Before I forget, I just got off the phone with Jim Keltner, and he just wanted me to send all his love to you. He's so happy to. He just wants to make sure that you're in great shape and sends his love. I forgot.
That's very sweet to hear, man.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I talk to him every once in a while, and he just. I said, I'm about to hit with Robben. He goes, oh, man, that's going to be great. So he sends his love. Did you, I remember Michael Shreve. I know he's a little bit older than you, but he was climbing He was climbing through the ceiling at Stanford to see Coltrane with McCoy and Jimmy Garrison. And then at night, he saw a concert there, and then he couldn't get into the jazz workshop because he was too young. And his dad got in. Sure. He was like a little puppy dog looking through the window, watching Elvin just blow through the bar. There was no bar lines. And did you go? I know you the Avalon. Those were the more hippie skiffle player kind of clubs. Although they'd obviously bring in heavy blues cats. But did you go to the workshop? Did you go see Rahsaan Roland Kirk blowing circular breathing? Did you get to see those guys? To me, some of the issues revolving individual sound have to do with the fact that these guys were beyond accessible on the bandstand. I mean, Marty Ballin was talking about John Coltrane going at the workshop to, in the middle of his solo, he'd go and take a piss and he was still blowing, and then he'd come back to the bandstand. I mean, it was a visceral, raw situation. And I just wonder about, not that you and your brothers were playing standard jazz, but did you have a chance to see these cats up close?
Yeah. When I finally left high school, at 18, I made a fake driver's license,
Mm-hmm.
so that I was 21 according to the law.
Right.
Well, not according to the law, but,
According to your license.
So I had a fake ID.
Yeah.
And my brother Patrick and I used to go to, the Both and the Matrix, Keystone Corner up in, the Bay Area around there.
Absolutely, dude.
So, I saw Pharoah Sanders, Ornette Coleman with Dewey Redman, Lee Morgan, Freddie Hubbard, McCoy Tyner. We saw a lot of those people.
Robben, you saw them and you saw them before synthesizers and synthetic music too. You saw them in these acoustic, authentic settings. They were playing to the. Can you talk about would you walk out of forget the technique or the theory or whatever? I mean, that's all I want, Robben. I want to be able to walk out of those shows in a contemplative Zen state. I mean, can you talk about what it did just to your psyche to see those cats blowing and playing as if their life depended on it? Because that was the most erogenous time in music, in my opinion.
Yeah, I hear you. It's certainly mind-blowing and mind-expanding, and really, just kind of all thought would go away, You'd just be in this space of, resonance, like kind of a vibration. You would have picked up a vibration, and, you didn't talk a lot afterward.
Absolutely.
I think you even said contemplative Zen kind of state. I would say that's not a bad description of it, because you're just in a space that's kind of beyond thought, and of course we all knew that that's what we wanted to do. We didn't know how to do it, but we threw ourselves at it. That's how I kind of relate to it. It's like the way people like what became, I guess, sort of new wave, not new age, new wave.
Yes.
Or punk.
Early punk
music.
Yes.
Yeah. So the attitude that, those people, Nirvana, that they came at their music, that's how we were coming at our music, and just throwing ourselves at it, whether or not we could do it, we just threw ourselves at it. So it was all very non-intellectual. It was very emotional. It was very painful. It was exhilarating. And, I finally started to calm down a little bit in my early 20s when I got that book on chords. And I still would go to the gig and do the same thing, but that's when I started to study, a little bit more. Everything happened very quickly, as you can imagine. I mean, I was working with Joni Mitchell and Tom Scott and the LA Express when I was 22. And this was, still at that time, I had a little bit of an idea of how to play through chord changes, but not so much. And after that tour with them, that first tour with them, that's when I started studying scales, I think. It's hard to remember exactly, but that's when I really started to kind of, get a little bit better understanding of what it was that I was trying to do.
Just going back to the KPFA reference by Matthew Kelly, do you apparently those tapes are out there. Have you ever heard your performance from that event?
No.
I just wonder what it was like for you to be around some of the old school. I know, and I've interviewed Louis Shelton multiple times, Dean Parks. I haven't talked to Larry Carlton yet. David T. Walker, all the studio cats from the Southern California area, and they used to talk about like Tommy Tedesco and Barney Kessel. Like they didn't like rock music, and they could play it, but they didn't like it. And a lot of the producers didn't necessarily know how to arrange for rock tunes at that sort of pivotal time. They'd say things like, oh, play that Swamp Thing or that Jimi Hendrix kind of thing. And so those guys kind of were able to assimilate, even though they were jazz freaks, and that's what they came up with. Guys like Louis and Dean, they were able to write for the Monkees or different kinds of Johnny Rivers, different kinds of rock tunes and things like that. And I just, you made this really good point about just it being a non-intellectual time in music, or just at least from your experience, it was much more visceral and emotional. And I just wonder about, like, what you glean the most from some of the older musicians about, playing, telling your story and not, because I just feel like today we're saturated with material, Robben. Kids that go to the academy. I mean, Charlie Mariano used to go to the Schillinger House, which then became Berklee School of Music. He'd come off the road to clean up if he was having an addiction issue, or he'd pick up a new instrument at Schillinger House, and then he'd go back on the road as a already professional musician. And nowadays, people are going to the academy. They're learning to transcribe solos from Charlie Parker, although no matter how many times you do that, it's never going to sound or feel the same. And there's no guarantee of a gig. And I just wonder what you picked up from guys that were professional musicians who had lived the jazz life, and what that life, and how you tried to live that life so you could, basically be burning inside and throw yourself into whatever music. Like you said, you were addicted to the music. And I just wanted you to talk about your concept of what you glean from those guys in terms of that jazz life, because I feel like the most authentic players, Bloomfield included, there's suffering. There's suffering involved, and that's what makes it authentic.
Well, when I first started getting noticed and started working, beyond, I worked with Charlie Musselwhite for about a year, my brother Patrick and I.
Right.
And then I was with Jimmy Witherspoon for 2 years. Spoon was definitely, from the heart of it. And, life on the road, had a rhythm and blues hit, early in his career. He's a blues singer,
Sure.
And so, there was some exposure there to, I think, what you're talking about. I mean, Spoon was always on. He was always on. He was a performer,
Sure.
really.
Oh, yeah.
But, then when things, broke a lot wider open for me was with Joni Mitchell, which was a whole different kettle of fish, and the LA Express. And, the guys in the LA Express were all seasoned jazz musicians who were making a lot of money in the recording studio and living in the valley.
Absolutely.
So, they actually had pretty cushy lives. Max Bennett was the oldest, and he used to work with Stan Getz, and Getz was a total heroin addict, and he was always like kind of walking him around the room trying to sober him up. And
it's funny. I did about 4 dozen radio interviews for a Stan Getz documentary, and Max was one of them. That dude was the baddest cat, and he was like, he played upright with Stan Kenton. I think he played with Bird one time. He was a monster player.
He may have.
Yeah.
You know, he was always on the electric when I worked with him with the LA Express, and you know, certainly with that band, he was great. So,
but yeah, walking gets around, trying to like, you know, just keep him stable. I mean, you know, that it's almost folkloric in some way, you know, but it
oh, for sure,
you know, but it did give them a story to tell. I think that through this, my question is probably, Robben, like, you know, when did you begin to start telling your own story? Like, was it with the Express? Was it before then with Musselwhite? When did it start?
Right away.
Wow.
At the beginning, I always just poured myself in. You know, I just blew my brains out, whatever I was doing. That's what I mean about throwing myself at it.
I love it. Yeah.
It was. I was always on 11. You know. And that was useful in the beginning to just get me on a bandstand. You know, a lot of people stage fright. You know, they're nervous about it, but you know, I was like, I just need to play, so I need to get out there on that bandstand. So yeah, it's always been very personal for me. I mean, I sounded like Mike Bloomfield for a while, for sure, and was proud of it. You know,
absolutely, man.
Because that was my man, but he's the only person that I ever really sounded like. And eventually, you know, like some Hendrix influence would come through. I mean, there was a period of time, excuse me, in my 30s where where the Albert Collins influence started to come through. It was sort of like, now I can do that. I couldn't do it back then, you know.
I love this.
And I don't know why. But, you know, it wasn't until in my 30s that I was able to kind of sound like Albert Collins. And that happened also like Hendrix. I listened to a ton of Hendrix. I couldn't play like him for nothing. But eventually, like in my 40s, Hendrix started coming through. So it's kind of wild, you know, but it was always, you know, very important to me to make my own statement, you know.
Did you get a chance to hang with Mike Bloomfield eventually? Did you connect with him personally?
Sadly, not really. I did meet him once, very briefly.
Yeah, it was. I always look at his you know, his bass player John Kahn very much deep in my soul on this journey, and Mike as well, and I just always looked at Mike as such a beautiful cat, and he was like, he'd go on the stage in a bathrobe. You know, the guy was like so unpretentious, and he just was the most amazing player. And
well, he was a junkie.
That's what I'm saying. And you know, it's funny because you know, he was a junkie, and towards the end of his life, it ate him up. And it was like that that I look at Cipollina and I look at Bloomfield. See, that's what I wanted. I'm so glad you brought that up. So, in your mind, I've vetted this pretty deeply, but I couldn't ask a better person. I mean, you know, really, Jorma and Garcia were folkies. You know, the first rock players. Bloomfield was obviously Chicago native, but the first cats coming out. Like, what were your thoughts on Jerry Miller and Cipollino? Did you get off on Quicksilver and those cats? I mean, because they were not folk musicians. They were, in some ways, the first rockers out of the Bay Area.
Yeah, I didn't really, for whatever the reasons, I didn't connect with the Quicksilver thing. My brother Patrick loved it, so we had that first album, and I would listen to it, and I just didn't connect, you know?
Sure.
I mean, Jerry Miller, that's a whole other thing. He was clearly, you know, certainly blues influenced. And Moby Grape was sort of like an acid rock band. I love Jerry Miller. You mentioned Jorma Kaukonen, which he just became one of my favorite people. I had the privilege of doing a tour with him and a woman blues singer named Ruthie Foster. It was the three of us, you know, doing like a what do you call those things? Like PACs, you know.
I'm trying to help. I don't know. I'm at a loss. I don't know.
Well, anyway, theaters people have season tickets, you know, that kind of a thing. But
Right.
anyway, he's a beautiful cat, and I always liked the way he sounded with Jefferson Airplane, but I didn't follow Hot Tuna or anything like that. But you know, in a way, I think you're kind of right. I'm sure that New York had, you know, a similar kind of a rock scene going on, but all the attention was on the West Coast, you know.
Absolutely. I'm only talking about like that Bay Area scene because there obviously were different pockets. I just wanted to ask you about, like, I think it's also interesting. Can you talk about how the Charles Ford Band got a record deal?
Well, the band had broken up, and my brother Patrick had become friends with Chris Strakowitz, who had the label Arhoolie, which was almost entirely.
I love that. I'm so glad you brought that up. I love that label so much. Talk about the blues, you know?
Yes, you know, very country blues oriented. I think, you know, when Patrick and I were still with Charlie, we actually did a record on Arhoolie with Charlie, for sure. I know we did that. It had to be before the Charles Ford Band, but
absolutely
we only did the one record for Arhoolie, and that was Chris Strakowitz was a big fan of our little group. You know, he just really liked us, and when he found out that we'd broken up, he called my brother Patrick and said, "Look, you guys, we need to document this." And Patrick said, "Hell yeah!" And so we went into the studio and cut the real Charles Ford Band album. We were already broken up.
So that's fat. So what? And was it in the Bay Area? What studio did you record it in?
Oh, some funky little studio in Berkeley.
Unbelievable. And then I would assume, because you guys had broken up, basically there was no like touring the album. You just made that for a legacy kind of thing.
Yeah, the Charles Ford Band never toured. I think we did one tour, sort of tour up to Washington State. I remember we played in Bellingham, and we might have played in Portland, but the Charles Ford Band was strictly local, man. We never got out of Dodge, you know.
I like the fact that I love the fact that you did everything from Lowell Folsom to John Coltrane. I mean, that is about.
What do you mean, did everything?
Well, I mean, I'm looking at.
Oh, you mean the music?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the
music. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, wow. I mean, that's about as diverse a palette as you can possibly get. I got another.
Well.
Yeah. I got another Name That Voice. I think this is going to bring a smile to your face. Take a listen to this, and we'll come back.
Okay.
And I think the biggest thing, and I've had a number of really good guitar players tell me this. I remember Robben Ford telling me it. He says, "How can you be so much better than you are?" And I would tell him that basically when you get in that state of surrender in the moment inside the music, you know, stuff just happens. And when people ask me, what did I play? I'll look at them and I'll go, I have no idea what I played. I don't remember a bit of it. I wasn't actually there when it happened.
Can you talk about you want to take a guess at who that is?
I have no idea.
I just want to say, Robben, like, it's so beautiful. Thank you to Jerry Granelli for connecting us. But I mean, like, you have been on this trip with me. These are all radio interviews I've done. That was my dear friend, your dear friend, Terry Haggerty.
Oh, you know, I thought for some reason it might be, but I've only met Terry like once.
Well,
I've hung with him like once or maybe twice, very briefly. So.
And I just want to be
cool.
My fourth book is coming out, and that quote is in it because what I love about it is, I mean, he referenced you and how can you be so much better than you are, because we were talking about the ability to become a conduit for the music coming through you, and you have to get out of your own way, get out of your own ego, and stuff just comes out of you and you can't even explain it. So it's like what Haggerty said, it's like the Socratic method. You have to know what you don't know, and you have to be willing to let go of and I want of just the idea that you are in complete control of what's coming out of your apparatus. And I kind of wanted you to talk about, it could have been with Joni or even before. I mean, obviously you were on a spiritual path with music, you threw yourself into it, but can you talk a little bit about when you surrendered to the fact that you weren't fully responsible for what was coming out of your instrument? And the idea that, like people would come say, how'd you do that? How did you play that? You're like, I have no idea. I don't even know what I played. Where it was just, you got into a flow and you recognized that you were only partially responsible for what you were playing.
Yeah. I think it might have taken kind of a while. What Terry's talking about there, I think I always had a little bit more of a need to know exactly what I was doing.
Sure.
And so what finally, the place that I finally came to was realizing that I was never going to be, as great as my heroes. And therefore I stopped competing and relaxed with who I was as a guitar player. And that allowed for a lot more creativity. I'm a melodist.
Sure.
I identify more like, with Miles Davis than most. Paul Desmond's huge influence, and also Jim Hall, a super melodist.
Take Five.
So, yeah, and beyond. And I I always found, like I would try, to play like this guy or that guy. And I'm not talking about guitar players, I was listening to saxophone players. So, I wanted to beat John Coltrane, and of course that wasn't going to happen. Coltrane was very technical, very intellectual, very practiced, and he went that route. He didn't stop doing that. He used that intellectual approach. He was clearly very, beautiful sound, beautiful voice, super soulful. I'm not saying that he was cold by any stretch of the imagination, but at times he was cold because he was thinking about it. And then at other times he would, settle down.
Well, how much do you think that has to do with the fact that he walked the bar? He was an R&B cat like Sonny Rollins.
For a minute.
Yeah, before he got into bebop and the intellectual, he was honking and walking, even though he didn't like it, But he did that. He had the blues bass in him.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'm sure that he, loved that music, certainly to some degree, but I'm getting a little off track, I think.
Yeah, that's fine. You go with a stream of consciousness. Yeah, it's fine.
Well, what I'm trying to get to, I think, for my part, is that Terry, he had his way, and there are people who literally have that ability, to just surrender, to the moment, and I can't quite describe it that way personally. For me, it's more, I feel more like the samurai warrior type,
I love it, dude. I'm just watching Enter the Dragon right now. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, everything is, you pay attention to every detail.
Interesting.
But, that's what, like someone like Coltrane, would have done, Sonny Rollins. pay attention to every detail. And then something happens, that I don't quite, I'll be playing and I'm like going, I have no idea how I'm doing this, I know that space in a way, but to me, it's like, I'm very aware of it,
Sure.
I'm not lost in it, I'm not just like the music's pouring out of me. It is, but I feel very, in the moment. I feel very present with that. It's not, like I go into some other space. It's the same space, but it's like you're kind of transforming the space as opposed to surrendering to the space. You're kind of transforming the space, and then you realize, well, you are the space. But the spirituality of it is, more like a Zen, as opposed to cosmic consciousness.
Dude, I am. Robben Ford is on fire. This is what my show is about. What you just waxed there is just. Did you see the Sons of Champlin a lot, or a little bit?
I only saw the Sons once, and I think Terry was not even in the band anymore.
There was a cat.
But he was the first guitar player I ever heard doing what we're talking about. In that, he understood jazz and all the rest of it. He was the first guy I ever heard who, took a Gibson, I think he played a Birdland back then or something, but it was a jazz guitar, an instrument associated with jazz. Might have been a 175, and turned it up, played on the treble pickup. He's the first guy I ever heard do that.
Yeah, this cat Tim Weston said that. He said Terry Haggerty when he listened on radio, he was the first guy that helped me transition to being a jazz player. He started playing bebop licks over rock and roll and blues. You think that's a fair statement? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was so cool to hear that. I'm like, whoa, it was wonderful. I just loved him. That first Sons record, that record, I wore it out. And there's one song in particular. He takes this amazing solo. Can't remember which one it is.
You're talking about the Loosen Up Naturally, that first album?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. Yeah, he's such a beautiful cat. And I guess it's amazing that you only met him that one time, but he took that comment. That comment's going to be in my book. I think it's hysterical. I love it. How much there is something about the Zen state. As a leader, how have you tried as a leader or what do you think the most important components of leadership are, especially on the bandstand? My generation and younger, we're very much in the thinking mind. And all I want to do is be able to push people out of their comfort zone to get them into the spirit mind. And whether you want to call that cosmic, what you just said, cosmic intelligence, Zen, no one was better at that than someone like Miles. And I just wonder about kind of the techniques that you learned from the LA Express, from the being up close with Freddie and Pharaoh and Charlie, and the nonverbal leadership skills that you have carried to this day that you think are the most effective qualities of leadership.
Well, I must say it's a lot harder to communicate on the bandstand than any of us would like, No,
you're totally right.
You think you're communicating, but they didn't know what the hell you were doing or saying.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So for me, I got really tired of trying to tell people what I wanted, and because it almost never happened where things, really were, all right, we are all on the same page. That is really, really hard to find. I'm so sorry to say. But so for me, it's like, put together some music, put together a band, get together and play, and it's either working or it isn't. And sometimes you're stuck in that situation for a little while, but then move on. So I just try to give people some great music to play with a bunch of great cats, so everybody likes each other, everybody likes the music, everybody gets featured. It's like, what more can I do than give you all the room in the world to, play, and or hang yourself. And so that's always a possibility. And so, for me, it really is that. It's like, okay, here's what's going on, and you are fully invited to, participate, to add to. When I played with the LA Express, and of course, when you're in school, you're all friends and you're all learning together. So there's a lot of very, easy communication there. But when I was with the LA Express, I was, I don't know if impressed is the word, but it was very much the same. These guys were all great musicians, and everybody had everybody contributed. There wasn't anyone in the band who didn't offer something to the situation. Yellow Jackets were like that. There was another band that was just like, this is a group of people who really get along well, who each one of them brings something really cool that works with everything else. And those situations are really hard to find. But that's the way I, chose to work. It's like, just create the best situation possible to exchange, enjoy, play, and if it's working, great. If it isn't, then, okay, move on.
I love it. I mean, you talked so eloquently before about being in the moment, but still being very aware of what you were playing. And then even when you realize that you're in the flow, you're still aware of that.
Yeah.
Can you just talk, how did you learn? And I'm just asking you, you can say that you're not like this, but my favorite bands, again, you talk about people, just the likability and getting along with each other and simpatico. But, my favorite bands never play the same song the same way once. And I just wonder, with you, did you ever find yourself, or even to this, how have you avoided getting into a formula trip with a band? And where, ultimately you can leave the head of the tune and it's going to be different every night. I mean, you look at some really good musicians today, younger cats, and they're playing 3 or 4 minute tunes, even live, and the guitar player is amazing, but, he only gets 8 bars or 16 bars. He can't stretch. He can't go to the moon because the band leader's a little bit too uptight that it's not going to be perfect. And I just wonder how you have learned to not get into a rut, or how to break out of that formula trip, because we're people, my generation is hung up on perfection, and we have the technology to fix things now. And unfortunately, it's also breeding a lack of authenticity amongst the music, because they're pop, quote unquote pop. I mean, Joni Mitchell was pop music, and it was amazing music, and they were real musicians like you guys burning. And nowadays, some pop musicians are great, and some can't even play live because it's all enhanced. So how have you, or maybe, I mean, how do you get out of the formula trip and try to, always take the music where it hasn't been before without, losing the audience and, it becoming a total mess?
Well, we play the song, whatever the song is, and on the record it might be, 4 minutes long, but I always just open it up, somewhere in there, I open it up and say, okay, let's go. And what I have found frustrating is that, it kind of what you're talking about, in that a lot of musicians, they they've learned in a formal setting, and they actually don't know how to get, to loosen up and play.
Exactly.
They know how to play a part. They know how to fill a role, provide a service.
That's right. It's very exactly.
It's like, well, yeah. So it's like, well, that's cool, but now let's have some fun. Let's open it up. Let's make this a little more interesting. And you can put a jazz musician into a rock setting, and he would maybe not know what to do. Or I played this tribute to Miles Davis at the Montreux Jazz Festival. No, the North Sea Jazz Festival one year. And the band was incredible. But everybody was there to blow their brains out. It's like they got their moment and they just blow their brains out. And it's like, well, that's got nothing to do with this song.
Yes.
This fundamental thing that's going on. You're not playing to the music. You're just doing your own thing. And every one of these horn players, and they were like, I won't name names, but they were well-known guys. And it was clearly just about them. And
not the collective.
Yeah.
Or the conversation, rather.
There are plenty of jazz musicians who don't get the big picture.
That's really interesting. You just said, yeah. Well, yeah. Again, that's the. So what? I mean, how do you? Was that kind of a deflating situation? I mean, that must have been kind of. I mean, that wasn't inspiring. I would take it. I mean, when you.
No.
Yeah, not at all.
It's like, this is a tribute to Miles Davis. And
right.
We're playing his music, and that means it's a tribute to Miles Davis and his music. So let's do that. So, there's all kinds of holes, here and there in, musicians. Maybe they're not free enough. Maybe they're too free. So balancing the whole thing out, it really is a personal thing, although I do feel fortunate in that I started with the blues and R&B. We were way into, Stax Records and Wilson Pickett and Otis Redding and Aretha Franklin, all of that. And then just having a great desire to learn to be a better musician, started buying jazz records, exploring. And then I got to play with all these guys who were indeed, great players in the LA Express, behind Joni Mitchell. They were all great players, and yet they were studio musicians, so they knew how to back somebody up.
Exactly.
But it was always creative. They weren't like, okay, how does the record go?
Exactly. John Guerin was the craziest drummer. He was a big band drummer in LA. I mean, dude, the guy could play this. He didn't play by the book. There was no book. I mean, it was just burning.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, and
at the same time,
go ahead.
Yeah, able to come up with, just the right part at just the right place. He knew how to serve the music, and he knew how to play if playing was what was up. Even those guys, there was a little bit too much cocaine around in those days.
No, and John.
And those
yeah,
guys,
I know. John was a crazy dude. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a great cat. But it would get. I felt like edgier and get more carried away than I would have liked. And so I'm still a kid and searching. And I'll tell you where things made another really cool shift for me, just in my own learning, was, Tom Scott went off on his own. The LA Express stayed together, did another solo album, did another tour with Joni Mitchell. And we got back to Los Angeles, and I went to the studio, and Tom was working on, in fact, I think we were in the other room recording the LA Express record. And we went over to hang with Tom and hear what he was doing. And he was doing overdubs for his record, New York Connection, which had the group Stuff
Oh,
So that's
Cornell, Gordon,
Dupree,
yeah, Dig, yeah, Gadd.
Steve Gadd, and man, like I knew the engineer well because he had recorded the LA Express too, and so he goes, check this out. And he just put on one of the tracks, no melody, and the groove was just so deep, and then he solos up, the two electric guitars, just soloed them. Everything else you're not hearing, and I'm just hearing these two guys just got this thing going, and I felt like I would rather do something like that. That's how I felt at that time. Everything had just gotten kind of wild. And I felt the need for that earth again,
The earth, I love that, dude. Yeah, you're going back to your blues and R&B roots, That's what those guys
exactly.
were. Even though they could play, they made it look so easy, but they made it feel even better. I spent I became very close with this cat, and he's left the planet a couple years ago. December 2018, I was at his house in Toluca Lake, and we did a video Facebook Live interview, and he took me over. It kind of blew my mind. He showed me this picture of a tour that George Harrison did in 1973-74, and it was Billy Preston and Ravi Shankar, Harvey Newmark, Keltner was there, and a bunch of other people. And then all of a sudden, in the picture, on the right-hand side is Robben Ford. And the cat that I'm talking about is Emil Richards. And and I want, how is that, please explain. I mean, here you got 73, 74 Matt Kelly talking about Robben Ford blowing people away at the Berkeley Community Theater. And the next thing you know, you're doing a kind of a rock set, or the Indian Cats would come on first maybe, and then you guys would do a rock set. I mean, but how did you get into that band?
Well, we were out with Joni Mitchell, with the LA Express, and Tom, as well as Emil, as you know, I guess, they'd done a studio album with Ravi Shankar called Ravi Shankar and Friends.
I love that album.
So they both knew George already, because George was the producer. And, both Tom and Emil were called to work with them on the record. So we were in England with Joni Mitchell, and no one alerted me to this fact, and I think intentionally. I'm pretty sure that Tom knew that George was going to show up, but we're backstage after the show. I just happened to turn around, and there's George Harrison smiling at me, and he says, "Hello, Robben," and I'm like, "Holy mackerel!" So he had a tour planned, and he was actually looking apparently at the LA Express, because as potentially the group, we went out to his place. We had a couple of days off after those shows, and we went out to his place and hung through the wee hours of the morning, recording a couple of tracks for his album. Is the record called Hari's on Tour Express? That was the song.
Wow, I gotta look, dude. I gotta look that up. Wow, it's on Dark Horse. Yeah,
that's the name of the album. Yeah, and so he decided to, Tom was already doing, he'd already said yes to the tour, and he decided to go a different way with the rhythm section, but he asked me if I would do the tour through Tom. So that's how that came about, and literally, like right after we got off the road with Joni, Tom and I went into rehearsals with George. I mean, we've been on the road for for 9 months. And off and on over a 9-month period. And so Tom and I went straight into rehearsals with George, and then we did that tour, which was about, I remember it as like 2 months long, roughly 2.5 months.
I sort of had this dream that Robben Ford was playing like, polyrhythmic Indian music as well. I mean,
No.
No, you were, but so that the band that you were basically playing. Yeah, I'm looking here. Dark Horse, 1974, George Harrison. So you're basically playing. You were promoting that that album, but then also introducing kind of not just introducing, but giving the world some exposure to all these brilliant Indian musicians. I mean, it must have been kind of spiritual in some ways. I mean, it must have been a pretty hip thing compared and very different from what was going on with Joni.
Well, Robbie was wonderful, but we spent very little time with him or the Indian musicians. They stayed in a different hotel.
Wow.
They kind of kept them away from us.
What? Because there was a lot of partying and debauchery? Well, that's interesting.
Well, we worked so hard. There was partying going on. I wasn't really too much a part of that. I had my wife with me on a good part of that tour, and after we would go to the airport after the shows, go out to the airport, and fly to the next city. So we'd be checking into our hotel rooms at 4 or 5 in the morning.
Yes.
Go to sleep, get up, have something to eat, and go to sound check, like that. So, but I think when you have people like Billy Preston, and George was a total party animal. Tom, all these people, they were hanging, a little harder than I was even aware.
Well,
that was my scene anyway.
That is so fast. That is so fast. So the Indian Cats, I mean, they were staying like at a different hotel. So basically, you play the concert, but it was, it just to see. I want to play you this from Emil, this audio, because in some ways he's talking about George, but I feel the same way about you. So just listen, even though I don't know you personally. So just listen to it, and we'll come back.
Okay.
May not have been the best guitar player in the world, but his love of music and his non-embarrassed attitude toward music was infectious.
What do you mean non-embarrassed? You mean there was no snobism kind of thing? I mean, what does that mean?
No,
yeah.
It was like he was around a lot of good musicians on that tour, and he didn't care. He didn't care who heard him play, or he just played, man. He just wanted to play all the time, and I don't know how to say it, but he wasn't embarrassed to play anything in front of everybody, I mean, he was there to also learn. And he was more than just a Beatle. And there was no snobism about his playing, or he was humble. He was a humble player. And he impressed the heck out of me. I mean, he wasn't afraid to play with all the heavy cats, you know what I mean?
Right. I mean that almost brings tears to my eyes, and what I meant by I just feel like you're really humble, man, and I wonder if you were inspired by the same stuff that Emil was on that tour, about just George projecting, even though he wasn't John McLaughlin, he wasn't a flashy riffologist. He just was like, he loved music and he loved people. And I just wonder how it rubbed off on you, and how it affected you, and how it kept you over time, how it kept you humble in your own way, because you've been on the stage in very heavy settings with the heaviest cats in the world. But like you said, sometimes, like with that North Sea Jazz Festival thing, it can get very humbling and almost depressing. And I just wanted you to talk about your impressions of George and his impact that he had on you as a professional musician.
Well, I was very young. I literally had my 23rd birthday on that tour.
I'm going to send you the video because the YouTube clip, the picture that Emil showed, you look like you're a teenager.
Yeah, I was a baby. I actually saw that interview.
The YouTube
was that
one?
Not a visual?
It was a visual
Yeah.
one. Yeah. Oh, dude, oh my God. It was, to see you on there, I was like, I mean, you looked like you were having a ball, but it was like, I cannot believe, yeah.
Musicians like to play. So, but I was too young. I was in an environment that was really over my head. I couldn't really relate to George certainly the way that Emil did. Emil's older than George,
big time,
but he also hung out with them. They would hang for 2 weeks in Hawaii together.
Absolutely.
He really got to know him. Tom Scott, got to know him pretty well, and but I, on the other hand, was on the road with, all of these adults, too many drugs.
Yes.
I had my, as I mentioned, my first wife with me, and so, we weren't really partying, and it was grueling. It was that tour was one of the most grueling things I've ever done.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
It was just I really just wanted to go home, to tell you the truth.
What that is so you were too young to I totally dig it. I dig it. I mean, but did at that time, like what Emil, even though Emil was an elder of George's, did you pick up on what he was talking about, this just sort of infectious need to play music and not, like, he just seemed like a very humble cat. You didn't pick up on that?
No.
Yeah.
No, I did not. Again, too young. And I didn't spend the kind of time with him, you know?
Right.
So, well, actually, Jake, I'm going to have to go.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I it's been an absolute, I would love to do set 2 with you down the road if possible.
Sure. We
Cool.
can do that.
All right, cool. And is your brother around? I mean, I'd love to connect with Patrick.
Oh, well, he would be delighted, I'm sure. I can put you in touch.
All right. Well, I'll get a copy of this to you later. I had a ball. It's such an honor, and I also just we got a lot more to get to. So you do your thing, but it's really, I'm just trying to stay on my own righteous path, man. And I appreciate you taking the time, man.
Well, right on. Jerry said a lot of good things about you, Jake. So it's my pleasure.
Thank you, brother. We'll be in touch. All right.
All righty.
All right. Later on.
Bye.
Peace. Well, another feather in the cap for Jake Feinberg after 10 years. It's an honor to connect with Robben Ford via brother Jerry Granelli, a true music spiritual warrior. And that's it for the Jake Feinberg Show. We'll be back tomorrow. Until then, peace.